Welcome to the Polygamer podcast, where gaming is for everyone. Join us as we expand the boundaries of the gaming community.
I'm your host, Ken Gagney, in this week's episode of Polygamer.
Men, yes, we are dealing with more body image issues as a result, but we're not dealing with the same levels of violence and minimization that women deal with.
That's Duane de Four, activist and advocate, who appeared on my PAX East panel on fixing gender inequality in gaming. I recently interviewed him for about an hour on the issues of not just feminism, but gender equality and masculinity, how video games affect men, and how men can affect the general gaming culture and make it more inclusive for everybody. But first, some updates about equality and diversity in the gaming space. Gamergate continues to make headlines, but now it's not because of their attacks, it's because of the responses to the attacks. People like Brianna Wu are refusing to be victimized and instead are standing up to the bullies with a couple of different tactics. One is that she has established a legal defense fund for women who are being threatened and harassed. Details about that are on her Tumblr, and links are in the show notes of this episode. And also, she is offering a reward for anybody who can produce information leading to the arrest of anyone who has issued her death threats. On one hand, I'm sorry to see that it's come to this. My naive belief is that the long-term solution to this situation is for a change in understanding in who we are as a people and as a culture, and how we can respect each other and treat each other as individuals. Apparently, that not being the case, we are instead approaching a more punitive solution. However, I don't fault Brianna for taking this approach because I know it's not been her only approach. I've also seen her offer olive branches in trying to establish communication and understanding. When that fell through, it would only be logical for her to then take the step of trying to speak a language that will be understood by the people attacking her. So kudos to her for doing something and for standing up not just for her, but for all of us. Brianna has spoken several times on the Less Than or Equal podcast, which I consider an unofficial counterpart to Polygamer, or maybe it's the other way around since they actually launched first. Most recently, I was given the honor of having my turn at the microphone, and I was the guest on the Less Than or Equal podcast. Episode number 14 aired this past Monday and is available on their website. A link again is in the show notes. And we spoke for an hour about just about everything that I'm trying to do with Polygamer, my history in gaming and as a member of the press, and my YouTube channel, where I do my Let's Plays and unboxings. So if you're interested in knowing some of the backstory of this podcast, or you're interested in hearing about the many other fascinating and cool things that people are doing in geek culture, highlighted each week on the Less Than or Equal podcast, definitely go check it out. You can also hear me discussing issues of equality and diversity in two other podcasts that I host. The Indiecider podcast looks at indie video games and the game development process. And most recently, I looked at Spirits of Spring, an iOS game from the creators of Papo and Yo. Just as Papo and Yo is a metaphor for growing up with an alcoholic, abusive father, Spirits of Spring looks at bullying. The discussion I had with one of its developers was more about bullying than it was the actual gameplay. So if you haven't even played the game, you can still appreciate this interview, especially if you've ever been bullied, which, in my experience, many gamers have experienced, unfortunately. Another podcast is called The Pubcast, found at thepubcast.org, and it is a podcast about online publishing. Each episode is an interview with anything from an ebook author to a website designer to a database developer, any aspect of online publishing. It's a pretty wide net that we cast on that show. The most recent episode featured the webcomic Strong Female Protagonist, drawn by Molly Ostertag and written by Brendan Lee Mulligan. After the webcomic launched in 2012, they had a successful Kickstarter in the summer of 2014 to turn their webcomic into a trade paperback, which has recently received a distribution deal from Top Shelf. This webcomic features 19-year-old Allison Green, who decides to give up her superhero lifestyle and go to college because she wants to make more of a difference in the world than just punching people in the face. Along the way, she encounters and addresses a number of very difficult and socially relevant issues, including date rape. In this episode of the Pubcast, I talk with the creators about how and why they address these issues, and why they consider themselves social justice warriors. In fact, let me play you a brief clip from that interview. Would you say that Molly, Brennan, and Allison are social justice warriors, which has somehow become a pejorative among some groups?
Oh, hell yeah. How the hell was that? What genius was like social justice warrior? There's a real slur.
Yeah, I like to think myself as a social justice bard, I think.
Well, yeah, I'm a social justice wizard, but I do have 2 levels in social justice rogue, so I'm sort of like a social justice arcane trickster.
Check out that interview at thepubcast.org. The only other thing that's been on my mind lately is the movie Dear White People, which I saw recently. I honestly don't know if I have the background to fully appreciate the film and say whether it's satire or just racist. I will say that there were at least 2 laugh-out-loud moments that had me chuckling far longer than anybody else in the audience. I encourage you to go check it out and make a decision for yourself. However, the fact at the end of the film that some of the scenes portrayed in this movie are actually based on real-life events was, frankly, disturbing and terrifying. It reminds me of the documentary CSA, The Confederate States of America, actually more of a mockumentary based on a proposed history of our country, stipulating from the South winning the Civil War. It's not until the end of that film that you see some of the real-life products and commercials that this film is satirizing, and you realize, oh my god, we are closer to this reality than I realized. That's a little terrifying. But with that said, let's bring on Mr. Duane de Four for this week's episode. I am a fan of his blog, howmanly.com, and I'm also one of his co-workers at his day job. He is qualified to speak about any number of matters, and I'm sure you'll be hearing from him on other podcasts as well, but today we're here to talk about masculinity, which is not to be confused with men's rights, which is very often antipodal to feminism. Duane and I are both very much feminists, and we are here to discuss issues of gender equality and inequality, but from a perspective that I think is sometimes overlooked. This episode does come with a trigger warning for discussion of rape. It also features some of the language that has been used to speak to women in various online media in the past few months, and therefore it also has an explicit tag in iTunes. So I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Polygamer. As always, you're welcome to send feedback to feedback@polygamer.net. Also on the website polygamer.net, you can send audio feedback to the show, which we can play in a future episode if you like, or follow us on Twitter at Gamebits, that's me, or Duane at Trinid, Trinid4. Joining me today is Mr. Duane de Four, an educator, media critic, and activist, a program manager at MIT in the Violence Prevention and Response, and a consultant with Duane de Four Consulting. Hello, sir.
Hey, how you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
Great, great.
So you and I spoke together on a panel at PAX East 2014 called Fixing Gender Inequality in Gaming. And I confess that I didn't really do my homework before I asked you onto that panel, and I really lucked out at what a juggernaut you are in this industry. You have a BS in Women's Studies, an MA in Marketing Communications, and you have consulted with such organizations as the Air Force Sexual Assault Response Coordinators, the Mentors in Violence Prevention, the National Consortium for Academic and Sports, Futures Without Violence, and Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts. You are just everywhere. You're also on the board of the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, as well as a former Big Brother in the Big Brothers Big Sisters program.
Yeah.
And that is just scratching the surface of all that you have accomplished in this field.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. There's a lot of work to be done and a lot of organizations doing good work, so I'm happy to be affiliated with them when I can.
Now, how would you summarize what it is that you do or the field that you work in? What is your specialty?
Well, I specialize particularly in looking at sexual assault, dating violence, harassment, those kinds of issues, and doing prevention education around that kind of stuff. I guess you could also say I specialize in working with men around those issues. A lot of the organizations that you mentioned, the military, also professional sports teams, colleges and universities will often bring me in to, work with male groups. So sort of talking with men in particular about these issues because it's a topic that men often don't talk about, certainly often less so than women do. But, I work with all groups, but it's really sort of those topics and just sort of that prevention piece, getting people to think about what can we do to stop this stuff from happening. And then sort of offshooting from that, partly out of personal interest, but also because of that connection, I start looking at culture and how this stuff is fed through cultural norms and expectations and sort of gendered expectations, like masculinity expectations in particular. And, again, how all that contributes to these types of things happening.
Now, this is probably a big question, but why is it that men don't often talk about these topics?
I think for a number of reasons. I think one, typically, men, we don't necessarily, male friendships, we don't necessarily get as deep with certain topics as women often do. Obviously, that's a big sort of generalization. Everybody's unique. Everybody's friendships are unique, but sort of, just looking at across the cultural spectrum in general, men talk about these things a little bit less, but then also women, the high rates of assault that occur, more women know about other women, their female friends, who have dealt with these issues. And so it sort of becomes something. And not only that, but women are raised to, constantly be aware of the potential of rape and, taught all this stuff about how to keep themselves safe and all these kinds of things. So it's more of a present thing in women's lives than in men's lives, which, really shouldn't be the issue. Certainly, sexual assault, rape happens and harassment happens statistically more to women, but it does happen a fair amount to men as well. And that's part of why it's important for us to talk about it. One, because of the women in our lives that we care about, but also because this is happening to men and we're just not talking about it. And there's a whole set of cultural reasons why we're afraid to admit that this happens to men as well.
And that's one of the reasons I'm eager to speak with you today, is because there have been a lot of talk about women in gaming, both within the industry and within the media, and a lot of panels that I attend or listen to on these topics predominantly feature women on the panels. And I'm interested to get not only the male perspective, but also some discussion about men in gaming and how that contributes to the overall discussion about feminism and gender equality. So you write a blog called How Manly that examines what it means to be masculine, but from pop culture, my own family, etc., I think I have a pretty good idea of what it means to be a man. It involves football and power tools and muscle cars. So what is wrong with that image, if anything?
Well, so it's not so much what's wrong with it. There's not inherently anything wrong with that. The biggest issue with it that what I focus on is the aspect that that's sort of what we're told. This is what a man is, and that's it. Right? We're sort of given this one definition of masculinity. And what I strive for is coming up with variations of masculinity and accepting that that's not what all men are into, or that we shouldn't push all men to be into those things. That masculinity can be so much greater than that. Right. So, again, there's nothing inherently wrong with that stuff. I'm a huge football fan. My Saturdays, Sundays, Monday nights, Thursday nights, they're all dedicated to football. But I'm also much more than that. And that's what I would like, sort of culturally to be more acceptable. And not only that, but then there's often a set of concurrent behaviors that come along with that, right? And there are a lot of troubling behaviors that men are sort of taught to exhibit, ways in which men are, again, culturally, this sort of cultural norm of masculinity, taught to engage in behaviors that are self-harmful or harmful to other people. And so what I really try and do is question that and say, why is this considered part of masculinity? Why can't we expand this definition of masculinity? And I'm not trying to tell anybody, you need to be this way, you need to be that way, or this is wrong or that is wrong. But other than, I have a strong stance on things like violence and that sort of thing being wrong in pretty much every circumstance. But sort of norms of behavior, beliefs, things that we're into, depictions of what it means to be a man. Let's expand that. Let's question, what would it look like if it were something different? Let's make it okay to be more than just, what we've grown up learning, and accept people who choose to display masculinity in a variety of different ways.
I was at a healthcare internet conference just last week, and as one of the sessions, the presenter put a variety of corporate logos up on the screen and asked us, what does this logo make you think of? He put the Amazon logo up and he got such remarks as speedy or overnight or books or A to Z. And then he put the NFL logo up, and the first thing that he heard from the audience was domestic violence.
Yeah.
So that's a rather unfortunate definition of masculinity and how that brand has been tarnished in the somewhat recently.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good example of what I talk about as well. I mean, obviously because of what's in the media right now in terms of the amount of violence and that sort of thing. But, not every NFL player is violent like that. There are a number of great men in the NFL, guys who are just living their lives, who are, good husbands, good fathers, all that kind of stuff. I mean, we don't really hear about that, right? And so there's a sort of image of, the NFL is really held up as the ultimate depiction of masculinity in our culture right now. You could maybe make an argument that like MMA is possibly equal or even replacing that, but really in terms of like traditional masculinity, the NFL is held up as the greatest exhibitor of that. And then what becomes problematic then is that obviously it's a violent sport, but then when we start hearing about all the behaviors, the negative behaviors that some of the men are engaging in, right? Again, that's that co-current behavior stuff that I'm talking about, versus focusing on, you can be a good man, a caring father, husband, etc., and you can be gay, you can be all these different things and still be, tough if that's what you want to be, or live in a number of different ways.
All right, so football is one kind of game. Let's bring this discussion to video games, which is what Polygamer is about. In a recent episode of Polygamer, I spoke with Chris Barney about whether or not video games can influence or reinforce or change societal norms. Gamers love to insist that video game violence does not translate into real-world violence, and for the most part, there are multiple studies supporting that. But you cite such games as Grand Theft Auto and Binary Domain as providing negative examples of what it means to be a man, or if not negative, at least limited definitions of manhood. So what are these kinds of messages that games are conveying about manhood, and why do they matter?
Yeah, again, it's that very limited range of what it means to be a man. It's very stereotypical, especially when we start getting into race, but interactions with women, all kinds of stuff. No, I'm not arguing that these demonstrations of behavior in video games will lead men in the real world to act in these ways. I don't believe that video game violence leads to real world violence. However, we cannot say that all of these things do not have an effect to some degree, because we're not talking about video games in a vacuum, right? Video games depict certain behaviors along with movies, along with music, along with TV shows, along with advertising, along with books, on and on and on. And the point is that it creates this sort of, I say all the time that it's the air we all breathe, it's like a soup we all eat or swim in or whatever it is, right? It's just this, all of these things contribute to create this sort of sense of cultural norms and reinforce norms or beliefs or whatever it is, positive, negative, often negative, often very limited, right? So to pick one out and say this is a problem and the rest aren't that is totally incorrect. But let's look at the way that these things all work together and the sort of the norms that they help to create. And that's why I talk about that stuff. And as if you look at my blog, I don't just talk about video games. I'm talking about all these other aspects because I really do believe that they add up. Again, adding up not in a way that is saying go out and do this or in a way that is going to cause somebody to do it. But one of the biggest problems with these sorts of norms is what it does is it actually, more than creating violent people, it creates people who are numb to violence, right? It puts us in situations where when we see certain things happening that we really should be saying, hey, that's not right. Instead, we say, well, that's normal. That's the same type of thing that I see every day in all these other forms of media and among my friends or among my mentors or whatever it is, right? And so then we don't challenge it. So that's, to me, the biggest reason to stop to talk about these things is not because it's going to make us violent, but because it makes us ignore things that we should be saying something about, that we should be stopping, etc.
I think that was one of your beefs with Lollipop Chainsaw, which is how the various male characters in the game treat her, and you're a stereotypical high school student, but you question why is that the stereotype, and is that the only kind of high school student there is, and is this how high school students are supposed to treat their female peers?
Right, exactly. So this sort of the stereotype that all these young men are gawking at this young woman, and they're going to talk about masturbating to her, and what a great tits she has, and all that kind of stuff. Like, and people have argued that game is meant to be a parody. And perhaps it is, but to me, if it is, it sort of fails on that. It sort of more perpetuates than parodies that behavior to me. We get these constant reinforcements that this is how teenage boys act, right? And so then when we see that in the real world, we don't say, you know what, we can be more than that. And the reality is that we are more than that. Not all teenage boys act like that, and nor should they, right? And so just saying, all right, look, you don't have to talk to somebody. You shouldn't talk to somebody like that. And part of this is also getting people to understand why acting in those ways and talking in those ways is harmful to somebody, right? You see it in a game. Oh, this guy's, he's rescued by this young woman and he says, I'm going to masturbate to you. Haha, funny. Right. But if we really have a little bit of empathy and stop and think, well, how might somebody in the real world feel if they were told something like that? Right. Obviously it's a video game character. We can't examine her mental state or that any of those characters' mental state. But in the real world, we can sort of really think about why we should be challenging these behaviors.
What about other games like Batman Arkham City? You have an example on your blog of how the thugs in that game speak to Catwoman very derogatorily, but some people would argue that if this was a real-life scenario, this is how real male thugs would assault and approach a female antagonist. So can you have an adversarial relationship like that in a game and still have it be respectful and yet be realistic? I mean, if you take away that sort of language, is the game that much less believable?
I argue that that language makes the game even less believable, right? Because first off, you hear the same things over and over and over. So if you want to talk about believability, that gets broken right there, right? But then, yeah, it's based on a stereotype of, all the comments I get are, well, they're thugs and they're rapists, and obviously they're going to talk to a woman like that, right? What do you expect them to say? Here, my lady, which I think is so annoying. Again, first off, there's a whole set of assumptions and based in some negative cultural stereotyping that exists in that. They are, prisoners. So, of course, the first thing everybody jumps to is that they are thugs and rapists and murderers, right? If we want to, again, talk about the real prison population, we know the majority of people are in prison for drug-related offenses, non-violent drug-related offenses. All right, but okay, maybe that's too real. All right, we'll step back from that reality and we'll say, in this video game world, why does that sort of language make people think that it's more realistic? It's, again, it relies on these stereotypes of what it means to be a criminal. Based on that, then everybody assumes that that's the language that they would use, and that they would use this language only towards women, right? Because they don't use that language towards Batman or Nightwing or any of the, those are the two main male characters you're going to be fighting with. And yet then people are going to argue about men getting raped in prison, right? So wouldn't that language also be used towards men? Right? What's to say that language is only applied towards women? If men are being raped in prison, that means men are being dehumanized, sexualized, etc., by that same population, again, supposedly. So then it would make sense that same language is being applied towards men too, but we don't see that. So again, and this is all ignoring the fact that we're talking about reality in a game about, Batman, who, again, we can get into the lack of reality there, and Catwoman in this world that is completely false to begin with. So there's a sort of like schizophrenia going on in terms of how we view reality in video games, right? And again, it just comes back to wanting to justify certain behaviors and certain language that is directed generally at female characters, right? And it's really just coming up with excuses for why that should be normal that are based on a whole set of cultural stereotypes.
Let's talk a bit more about that relationship between men and women. In the real world, not in Arkham City, there has been a lot of talk lately about gender equality and feminism, stemming not only in the most recent discussion of Gamergate, but even going back to Anita Sarkeesian and her Kickstarter of 2 years ago, and well before that as well. And a lot of men seem to find this discussion threatening. Why is that?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. Certainly I'm not in these guys' heads, so I can't say 100% for sure. But based on what we see in general, in terms of when things are being challenged and historical context and all that kind of thing, I would say that there are probably a couple standard things that are happening. One is that we have, for some people, life is sort of very black and white. And once you start challenging that really messes with somebody's worldview. And that's a threat to them. That's a threat to their view of the world. And they will fight very hard to maintain their current worldview, to see things in the way that they believe, that they've been raised to believe, or whatever it is that they should be. And so when you start challenging their belief system, they freak out. I think that's part of it. I think you also have guys who want to view gaming and gaming spaces as male-only spaces. And so again, it's like, country clubs that don't let women in, or, golf clubs that don't let black people in. It's sort of, this is our space and we don't want that to change. And the reality is that gaming has never been an all-male space. And so all that's happening is that women are saying, trying to say that, and not just women, but people are saying, hey, this is not some sort of all male space that you think it is. And so we need to be more accepting. It's not an all white space either. Right. But some people don't want to accept that. They're threatened by that. Also, coming back to what I was saying about those cultural norms and how they stop people from saying something, they also encourage. There's always going to be a subset of people who are, in fact, angry, right, at women or people of color or whatever it is, right, who are, in fact, full of hate, who are, in fact, violent, have violent tendencies. And what happens is, when this sort of behavior and conversation is happening, I think you have some of those people who jump onto that because they say, hey, here's an environment where I can act in these ways that I want to act, where nobody's going to challenge me. So similar to when, we saw this recently when the San Francisco Giants won the World Series, right? Talking baseball. And in the celebrations afterwards, you had people vandalizing and getting in fights and committing all these acts of violence. I would argue that a number of those people are not actually baseball fans. They're just people who saw an opportunity to act in certain ways because nobody was going to challenge that, obviously, except for the police, right? And so I think we see something similar happening here as well. You have your misogynists, your angry men who are jumping in, who look for any opportunity to dehumanize and belittle women and exhibit their misogynist behavior unquestioned. And they're saying, oh, here's this thing that's happening where I can act like this and nobody's going to challenge me. And it's made even worse by the fact that it's on the internet, so it's totally anonymous. Right. So this is also, again, why we talk about we need to challenge these behaviors when they happen, because no, not every Gamergator is going to be the type of person who's sending death and rape threats. But when your movement uses the type of language and engages in the type of behavior that allows for that, then that subset of people who do act in those ways are going to feel right at home.
It just seems so strange to me how imbalanced the interactions are between men and women. For example, NFL player Chris Klew made fun of Gamergators and nobody attacked him, but Brianna Wu does the same thing and she gets doxxed. Or, for example, when there was a recent school shooting and several people outlined how this is just another example of what you call toxic masculinity and how so many school shootings are perpetuated by young men and not young women. based on who is making that observation, the response can be dramatically different. When Anita Sarkeesian said the same thing on Twitter, so many people were in an uproar over that, and yet you outlined it very logically on your blog and received none of the hate that she receives, or so it seems. Why is there such a dramatic difference when a statement comes from a woman instead of a man?
I think the reason that this happens is, again, they're already a targeted group. Women are already a targeted group by this movement, right? And so they are easy to attack in that sense because, no violent behavior towards a person or a group of people exists without some dehumanization having already occurred, right? As a group, women are often dehumanized in society, sexualized, that sort of thing. And so then it becomes easy to engage in harmful behavior towards them, right? And so in this movement, we see that playing out. And men don't get challenged because, men are sort of seen as peers or equals, or you may disagree with them, but this is still a man versus, well, here's this woman who's a dumb slut who shouldn't be speaking, who shouldn't be saying these things, who's challenging my reality and my world and my beliefs, and threatening in that sense. So it's really not that hard for me to threaten that person because I don't see them as an equal. I don't see them as a full person in that sense. And again, my argument isn't that the existence of this movement or this language or these cultural stereotypes means that everybody's going to engage in it. But again, what happens is that then when people act like that, you have others who say, you know what, it's not that big a deal, right? Or I'm not going to get involved because why would I risk myself for this, person who I don't really see as a full person, right? I think that's a big part of what we see happening. And of course, then when you have people like Anita Sarkeesian or Brianna Wu or anybody else who's very vocal in talking about this, then they become a focus, right? They become an easy focus for that sort of energy. And then those people who are inclined to that sort of behavior, they just come out of the woodwork and they run free.
Yeah, those two women, as well as many others, have been the focus, as you say, of Gamergate in the past few months. And on your blog, you recently referred to Gamergaters as an obvious example of toxic masculinity. What do you mean by toxic masculinity, and how does that apply to Gamergate?
The aspect of toxic masculinity is, again, coming back to the ways in which men are often taught to respond to things with violence or aggression, right? Rather than communicate and, let's talk things out or let's have some empathy for someone else's point of view. And so, this is what I talk about when men engage in behaviors that hurt other people, and again, sometimes ourselves as well, is that when when threatened, oftentimes men are taught to respond violently, right? And so whether that's a real world threat or we see something happening, we get angry, we respond instantly with violence and aggression, right? And so this is where, again, this is why I talk about toxic masculinity, because masculinity itself does not have to involve those sorts of behaviors. But men are taught this is how a real man responds to a threat, right? This is how a real man responds when he sees something he doesn't like. And if that's the stuff that needs to be challenged and questioned and say, why does it have to be that? Why can't we have some empathy for the fact that somebody else's experience is different than ours? Really consider what that means and respond in that way versus instantly, what are you talking about? This is bullshit. I'm going to freak out and threaten and do all these harmful things, right? The connection to events like a school shooting is, again, I'm not saying that these people are someone who would go out and commit a mass murder type scenario, but it's a lesser version of that sort of same response. I've been hurt, and so I need to hurt others because I have no other way of processing this. And this is what I've been told. This is how a man exhibits his masculinity.
It sounds like from your blog that you recently met a potential Gamergater in real life, and it was in a situation that caught you a little bit off guard. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think, and I wrote about this in my blog, that obviously for me, there were some levels of stereotypes that contributed to that, right? Sort of assuming that no women actually believe this stuff. It's always surprising when here I am and I'm presenting and I'm showing examples of, these violent threats that Anita Sarkeesian had received, and somebody just instantly shuts that down and just says, they're faking it, which is really, it's just a denial of someone else's reality in order to maintain that person's view of how things should be or how things are. Right. It's really based in a lack of empathy. And so to me, there's that question that we're raised to challenge things and to question things and be skeptical of things. And my question is always, okay, you can be skeptical and you can, question things, but if somebody tells you that they have experienced this sort of level of violence or these negative interactions, what does it really hurt to just say, okay, I believe you. I believe that has happened to you. You can still be skeptical of their worldview or the points that they're making while also saying, I'm sorry that you received that threat or that amount of violence, right? And so to have that happen in the class, they're, in the real world, not on the world of the internet, where it can really feel like, just some sort of almost robotic thing. Like it's easy to forget that there's a person on the other end who's acting in these ways. So when I saw that happening in the real world, I was definitely taken aback by it, and I wish I had more time to really talk to this person. Like, why is it that you can't accept that somebody has actually faced these threats and how negatively impacted their life has been? Because to me, those were two separate points. There was the, her approach towards games, or her depiction of games is unfair and unbalanced, which I disagree with, but hey, that's a viewpoint that can be debated if you want. But to say that somebody is making up threats, which are easily verifiable, on the internet, you can find the police reports. She actually did leave her home because of these threats. Like, to deny that is just a complete lack of empathy, and something that I always have a hard time with when I encounter anyways.
What surprises me about people who deny that reality is that it flies in the face of Occam's razor. They think it's easier to believe in this sort of conspiracy theory than it is that somebody received a death threat.
Yeah, and again, it's because of, that when these things threaten somebody's worldview, and it's amazing the leaps that people will go through to preserve their beliefs or their worldviews when they're challenged, right? And as you said, because I always find it funny when people engage in these debates online or even in person, people start bringing out, logic and, well, that's the fallacy of this, and you're, doing this and that, without ever examining the fact that they're doing everything that they can to preserve their worldview, rather than just considering, somebody else's point of view, somebody else's opinion. You don't have to agree, but when you just instantly start shutting stuff down, then yeah, you're really just fighting hard. It's a totally emotional reaction, but men don't have emotions in that way. Our prime emotions are anger, and we respond in that way, versus really, realizing, hey, you know what, we're people who have a full range of emotional responses. So let's just be aware of that and think about what is it that's really going on with you that leads you to believe this and to feel threatened, versus just sort of assuming, oh, that person's lying, they're full of shit, I'm going to question everything about them.
Yeah, you don't need to spend much time on Twitter to find the sort of hate and threats that people like Brianna and Anita receive. some of the ways I've been told that this needs to be addressed is that these women just need to grow a thicker skin, that this is just internet trolls who are getting their jollies, and if you ignore them, they just go away, and they don't mean anything by it because it's just online fun, and this is the way gamers talk to each other, is they, it's smack talk. So what would you say to that sort of response?
I would say that it's easy to say that when you're not the one being confronted with that sort of behavior, right? I mean, again, that's another way that people are shutting down empathy, right? And they're just saying, well, that's not my experience. So this person is just being hypersensitive, right? That's what's so frustrating about it is wanting to deny, particularly women's experience. Men, straight, white men, most often, who haven't dealt with these things, lacking in empathy and just not allowing their minds to go there and allowing themselves to understand what this might feel like. Because that's all it takes is just a little bit of consideration to what might it feel like if every minute of the day I'm receiving this sort of, these sorts of threats with this sort of language and this sort of dehumanizing behavior directed at me, right? You don't have to have actually experienced it to really just sit down for a second and consider what that might feel like. And then, of course, part of why people don't do that is because then it begs the question, well, what should I do about that then? Right? Shutting something down, ignoring it, allows you to stay safe in your own little bubble and never engage in any behavior that puts you at risk of being threatened and harmed because you're helping someone else out, right?
Yeah, it's easy to say to grow a thicker skin, and I'd like to think that if people started tweeting mean things at me, that I would just blow it off. I've been on the internet for 20 years since I was a sys-up on CompuServe. I'm accustomed to this. But at the same time, I've read over 15,000 of my own YouTube comments that people have left on my videos in the last 2 years. And there are some that really get to me, and I still remember months later, I'm like, that really bugged me. And if these were, intentionally, consciously being cruel and aggressive and threatening, reality is that no matter how much I would like to think I have a thicker skin, that would probably shake me, just like it has Brianna and Zoe and Anita.
Yeah, exactly. There is no amount of thick skin that can protect you from feeling that. Feeling threat, and it's funny too when people minimize threats that somebody receives. If somebody calls in a bomb threat or, some sort of terrorist type threat, we've learned as a society, take threats seriously, right? And because of, major events, major terrorist events like 9/11, right? And so it makes complete sense and it's completely logical and it is the right thing to do to take a threat, even if it's over Twitter, some sort of internet comment threat, seriously, because you never know if a person, whether it's the person who actually made that threat or not, is going to actually follow through on those things. And so, again, it's just to deny that and to question that is to shut down empathy. Basically, you're supporting that behavior by not allowing somebody to vocalize that this is what's happening to me and it needs to stop.
I've heard people say that Brianna and Anita are wasting the police's time by having them investigate threats that were probably never intended to be made real. But it's not the victims who are wasting the police's time, it's the people making those threats, because the potential victims can't afford to dismiss any one threat because 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000 may prove true, and they can't take that chance.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I think it's the greatest thing that Brianna has now put out this, you get a reward for helping capture the people who are threatening her, because I think it's great that is happening, although I am saddened by the fact that it is Brianna herself who has to do it. And I've actually really been thinking about it'd be great if we could find some way, because it is women who are being attacked like this. It would be great if we could find some way for men who are not these types of men to rally around the women who are facing these attacks in a more substantial way than showing support online. Like, is there some way that we could engage or start some sort of group or movement or whatever that would be supportive in very substantial ways. And I think had someone else said, you know what, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to help put out this reward to get these people captured so that Brianna didn't have to do it herself, I think that would have been a great example of what I'm hoping can happen, right? And the reality is that's people need to see repercussions for their behavior. And that's partly why the internet can often become such a cesspool of this type of behaviors, because there's no real consequence for it, right? And so when consequences happen, and I don't, when I say consequences, I don't necessarily mean laws or jailing people or whatever, but, there needs to be, people need to understand, people need to challenge each other. These guys, friends who know who these people are, who are doing these things, need to be saying something to them, right? And when they don't have any consequences, and they continue to do it. So I really do hope that they catch somebody, right? Because that will show that there is a consequence for this behavior. And it'll probably be some 14-year-old kid, which is what's so sad about it. But yeah, I really hope that it works.
You talk about a potential rallying point for men, and it's not quite as punitive as what Brianna is proposing, but I've, in the last 6 months, become aware of two organizations, one called It's On Us, and the other that Emma Watson presented to the UN called He for She. Are either of these organizations taking steps in those directions that you propose?
Yeah, so these campaigns and this type of work is really about trying to engage men in addressing issues that women are talking about and often feeling unsupported by men in addressing. All right, and they're great campaigns. The downside in terms of this conversation is that they're not focused on gaming per se. Right, so it'd be great if we had some sort of gaming world campaign or effort that's focused specifically on the types of things that we're seeing in gaming. It's On Us can very much be applied to this world as well, but I think there would be real power in something originating out of the gamer movement, the gamer environment, the gamer culture, that's saying, this is how we're going to defend gamer culture, not by threatening other gamers who are women, but rather by standing next to and supporting and finding ways to expel those who are behaving in these ways.
As I mentioned, you, Brianna, and I were all on a panel together at PAX East. The video of that panel has been on YouTube since this past April, and it's garnered quite a few comments. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to address two of the more common criticisms that I get on that channel. I certainly don't mean to necessarily give these critics a wider platform, but since these are questions that I get over and over, I would like to be able to just say, hey, Duane said this, and that's the answer. That would make my life a lot easier. So one of the comments I get is that I don't remember that our panel talking all that much about rape so much as it was about the representation of women in gaming. But very often the comments I get on my channel are that it's sort of a red herring to be talking about women getting raped at all, because men get raped just as much, and even more so when you take into account the prison population. So why are we focusing on this specific gender, this specific demographic, so much when it's an issue that affects both of us?
When it comes to the issue of rape, and addressing rape, it's true that both men and women do get raped, and I think we do need to do a better job of talking about that. And I always find it funny when people bring up prison rape as like men get raped too. Look at prison, right? Men are getting raped in the real world. And the reality is men are being raped in the real world by other men, right? And so again, this comes back to looking at the ways in which men are taught to use violence, and then that sexual connection between that, the way that violence becomes sexualized. We do need to be talking about that. But to say, well, why are you focused exclusively on the experience of women is, again, it's just another shutdown tactic, right? And these people aren't bringing up men being raped because they're actually concerned about that. They're bringing it up because it's a way of trying to say, well, it's just shutting down the conversation that does need to occur. When rape is being talked about in this context, it's being talked about because of the depictions of the ways in which women are being sexualized and the connection, again, between that sexualization and the violent acts that are committed against them, right? So again, going back to that Arkham Asylum clip, or, that game, Catwoman is being sexualized at the same time that there's, she's fighting these other men, right? And the sexualization is things like, nice suit, take it off, that kind of thing. So there's a strong connection between the violence and the sexualization that we see happening. And so that is something that needs to be talked about, because this very much affects women, and men are not being sexualized in the same way. Right. And anytime somebody brings that up, they'll bring up a character like, so-and-so, this character has their shirt off and they're always running around in, Superman in his tight clothes and you can see all his muscles, not being sexualized. Right. Certainly not in the same way that a character, is like Wonder Woman is being sexualized, or, where breasts are hanging out and, you can see butt and all that kind of stuff. Right. And so it's important, again, to talk about that connection between sexualization, which is a form of dehumanizing somebody. They're no longer a person or a character. They are this sexual object. And with that objectification comes all sorts of harmful behavior, right? And one more thing on the prison rape thing, statistically, men get raped in prison at the rate that women get raped in everyday world, right? So about 1 in 4 men report being raped in prison. And what we see in everyday life is 1 in 4 women dealing with attempted or completed rape, right? So, that I think that's an interesting fact that really points to just how prevalent rape is for women in the real world. And men spend all of this time fearing prison rape. And, that when we talk about rape, we're talking about rape in that context. Yet the number is the exact same as what women are dealing with every day in our society. Right. So, yes, we do need to be talking about men being raped, but let's talk about what's really happening. Men are being raped by men mostly, and the rates are lower than what we see happening with women.
You mentioned a bit about how men are portrayed in games with their shirts off or running around muscle-bound. And some critics on YouTube have pointed to that as an example of how men are sexualized just as much as women are. They're very unrealistic body types and body physiques, setting a standard for men much like Barbie does for women that's unrealistic and unattainable. But I've also seen other critics turn around and say, no, that's not true. That isn't men being sexualized. That's men being created as part of a power fantasy. So those men are being presented as an ideal for men, just like how the women in games are presented as an ideal for men. Both genders are being created for men, and there's really nothing being created for women. Is there any accuracy or truth to either of those perspectives?
Yeah, I think there is. And here's the thing, is that we do need to be examining depictions of, and which is what I try and do, but we do need to be examining depictions of men in gaming and in media and that sort of thing, because it does have an impact on men as well, right? We're seeing a rise in eating disorders among men and steroid use in, young men, teenagers in particular. And there's very much a connection between that and the types of ways men are depicted in the media. And we're seeing more, sort of like the muscle-bound man thing. Depictions of that have, historically what would happen was women in TV shows or movies or, anything else would be, you would see a certain body type and that was upheld as the ultimate way that a woman should look. Meanwhile, you'd have all kinds of schlubby men or men, just looking average every day. Those would be, famous actors and famous characters, et cetera, et cetera. And so men felt less pressure on how they should look physically. But that's changed, right? We're seeing six packs and big chests and big muscles being depicted a lot more and being shown off a lot more. And so there is a connection between that and the rise in eating disorders and steroid use among men. So yes, we do need to be talking about that, right? But let's also not lie to ourselves, right? Because there isn't sexualization happening in the same way. There isn't that connection between sexualizing the male body and then assault being committed against that male body. There is more of a connection to power fantasies, as you're saying, right? Because these men, while they're depicted as having these types of bodies and that sort of thing, they're also the stars of the game, or the hero, or the main character. They have more character development, more dialogue, more, all these types of things that they are not being sexualized and dehumanized and minimized in the same way that women are, that female characters are. And the repercussions are very different, right? So men, yes, we are dealing with more body image issues as a result, but we're not dealing with the same levels of violence and minimization that women deal with because of it.
Well, it sounds almost in a way discouraging, and so much of what we've talked about today are the problems that are facing this industry and this community and this culture. And I'm glad that we have advocates and activists such as yourself working toward it, and podcasts like this that I hope are helping get the word out. Do you see any other signs of this industry and this community moving in the right direction? Are there, especially in the last few months, it seems like things have been getting worse. Are there any signs that things are going to be getting better?
I would argue that there are signs that things are getting better in general. To me, this whole Gamergate thing is intense backlash. And backlash happens when there's progress going on, right? It's those people who are threatened, who are fearful of what the future looks like. They're responding aggressively, violently, and all these types of things. But they are a small subset, right? What we see happening is now there are all these comments being made by game developers. There's articles being written that are denouncing Gamergate. There's memes now that are making fun of Gamergate. So they sort of exploded on the scene, really seemed like, oh man, it's over for gaming and this is what it's become. But again, in my mind, they were a vocal minority that got a lot of attention. But now people have started reclaiming the gaming space and saying they do not represent us, and this is our way forward. They will eventually die down and go back to whatever hole they came from, right? Meanwhile, as a culture, we're going to continue advancing. And, people like Anita Sarkeesian are going to help that advancement, are going to, in large part create that. Brianna Wu, there's all this talk and attention being paid to how can we make gaming more of a welcoming space. And the only thing that Gamergate backlash did, in reality, was hasten that discussion, right? Was lead more people to say, hey, this is a conversation we need to have, so let's have it. They had their 15 minutes and, they're still out there, right? And I also don't mean to say that they are not a threat that should be taken serious. They are. But if you're talking about what I see going forward, I see them sort of fading away, or being, I shouldn't say fading, being pushed out of the way by those who are saying, we're not going to stand for this. And I am starting to see that happening already.
It is true that Gamergate has, in a way, painted gaming culture in a negative light in a very public way because this is getting so much press. But at the same time, the issues of gender inequality have existed in gaming for many years now, and it's helped bring that issue to light as well, with front-page stories in the New York Post and the Huffington Post, and responses from companies like Adobe and Blizzard. So I hadn't really thought of it the way you're putting it, but that's true that the issues are getting attention as well, not just the Gamergate movement, but the issues of gender inequality. You're right that we're starting to hasten, I hope, the awareness that something does need to change, and with it, the rate at which that change is happening. One thing that Zoe Quinn said that I really admire, and I don't mean to paint her as a saint, but she has in no way deserved any of the negative attention and treatment that she's received in the last few months, and I so do admire her for putting up with it and still being there. And she once tweeted, "If there's one thing I've learned from video games, it's that when you encounter enemies, you're going the right way." And we've certainly seen a lot of that in the past few months.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they're responding to a threat against, their view on things. And so, yeah, that is very much a sign that we're heading in the right direction. I very much agree with Zoe Quinn on that. So it's difficult, it's difficult, certainly. And sadly, some people are facing these threats, and I hope we can find some way to deal with that. But yeah, the progress is happening, and it's going to continue to happen, regardless of what those in Gamergators and others want.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad that you are there to help us advance that discussion. Remind our listeners where we can find you online.
You can follow my blog, How Manly, at howmanly.com. You can also learn more about me personally and the work that I do at my personal website, DuaneDeFour.com. And of course, I'm also on Twitter, at TriniD4. Yeah, and those are the major ways you can find me online.
And how do you spell that, Trinid4?
TRINID and the number 4.
Excellent. Well, Duane, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you speaking to the Polygamer podcast, and we hope that we will continue this conversation in other media, at other conventions, and on other podcasts.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
This has been Polygamer, a Gamebits production. Find more episodes, read our blog, or send feedback at polygamer.net.